There's nothing quite like watching someone you love struggle, knowing you can't fix everything for them. Every parent who's ever worked two jobs, every person who's ever been looked down on because of their circumstances, knows this feeling in their bones. Layla Wren had everything money could buy, but nothing that truly mattered. Samir Ortega had lost his engineering career and his wife, leaving him to raise his autistic son while working at a small-town repair shop. When her rare Ferrari broke down and no elite mechanic could fix it, she brought it to his humble garage as a joke. She thought she was dealing with just another small-town nobody. She had no idea she was about to meet the man who would change everything she believed about worth, respect, and what it really means to fix something that's broken. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun painted long shadows across the cracked asphalt of Ortega's auto repair, where Samir stood hunched over the open hood of a weathered pickup truck. His calloused hands moved with practiced precision, feeling for the source of a persistent engine knock that had puzzled the vehicle's owner for weeks. At 52, his dark hair showed threads of silver at the temples, and deep lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights and heavy responsibilities. The garage itself told a story of modest dreams and careful maintenance. Tools hung in perfect order on pegboard walls, each one cleaned and returned to its designated spot despite their age and wear. The concrete floor bore permanent stains from decades of oil changes and transmission work, but it was swept clean every evening. A small office in the corner held a metal desk covered with invoices, parts catalogues, and a framed photograph of a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Samir's worn toolbox sat open beside him, its contents revealing the contradiction of his current life. Mixed among the standard wrenches and screwdrivers were precision instruments that belonged in an engineering lab, digital calipers, torque measurement devices, and specialized gauges that cost more than most people's monthly rent. These tools whispered of a different life, one where Samir Ortega had been Dr. Samir Ortega, automotive engineering consultant to luxury manufacturers across 3 continents. The pickup's owner, Mrs. Henderson from the local diner, waited patiently in a plastic chair beside the garage door. She'd brought him a thermos of coffee and a plate of homemade cookies, the kind of small kindnesses that defined relationships in Millbrook Bay. This coastal town of 8,000 souls existed in the shadow of wealth, where the working class served the seasonal residents who arrived each summer in their imported cars and designer clothes. "Found your problem," Samir announced, straightening his back with a slight grimace. Years of bending over engines had left their mark. "Your fuel injector's been running lean on cylinder 3. Probably been that way for months, but it's finally gotten bad enough to cause the knock you're hearing." Mrs. Henderson nodded as if she understood, though the technical details sailed over her head. What mattered was the quiet confidence in Samir's voice, the certainty that came from true expertise. "How much will it set me back?" "Parts'll run you about $80. Labor's another $100, but I can spread the payments if you need." This was Samir's way, never making anyone feel ashamed about money troubles in a town where they were common as morning fog. As Mrs. Henderson left with promises to return Monday morning, Samir heard the familiar sound of the school bus rumbling down Coastal Highway. He checked his watch. 3:15. Miguel would be walking up the gravel drive any moment, backpack slung over one shoulder, moving with the careful, deliberate steps that had become second nature. Miguel Ortega was 12 years old and saw the world through a lens that filtered out social conventions but magnified mechanical beauty. His autism manifested not as a limitation but as a different kind of clarition that found patterns where others saw chaos, solutions where others saw problems. He'd inherited his father's gift for understanding how things worked, though he expressed it in ways that often surprised the adults around him. "Papa!" Miguel called as he approached the garage, his voice carrying that particular cadence that made every word sound carefully considered. The bus driver's transmission is making a grinding sound in second gear. I counted it happens every time between 15 and 20 miles per hour. Samir smiled, wiping his hands on a shop rag. Did you tell Mr. Rodriguez? He said it's fine, but it's not fine. The harmonic suggests worn synchronizers. Miguel set his backpack down with the same precision his father used when placing tools. Can we look at it tomorrow? If Mr. Rodriguez brings it by, we'll take a look. Samir ruffled his son's hair, marveling as always at the boy's ability to diagnose mechanical problems by sound alone. How was school? Miguel's expression shifted slightly, a subtle change that Samir had learned to read like a diagnostic code. Tommy Morrison called Mrs. Patterson's car a piece of junk again. I explained that her 1,998 Honda Civic has proven reliability metrics and excellent fuel efficiency, but he laughed. The pain in his son's voice cut deep. Miguel's literal interpretation of the world left him vulnerable to casual cruelty, unable to understand why accuracy mattered less than conformity to his classmates. Samir knelt down to Miguel's eye level, a gesture that had become ritual between them. Tommy's still learning that being loud doesn't make you right, Samir said gently. Your observations are valuable, Miguel. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. They walked together toward the small apartment above the garage, climbing the narrow staircase that led to their home. The space was modest but carefully arranged, with Miguel's need for order reflected in every corner. His collection of car manuals sat alphabetized on homemade shelves, while his drawings of engine configurations covered one entire wall like mechanical artwork. The kitchen held remnants of their morning routine, 2 cereal bowls in the sink, a coffee mug with "World's Greatest Engineer" printed in fading letters. Samir had kept the mug through everything: the layoffs, the bankruptcy, the desperate move to Millbrook Bay when his savings ran out. It served as both reminder and accusation, depending on his mood. While Miguel worked on his homework at the kitchen table, Samir prepared their dinner with the same methodical approach he brought to engine repair. Chicken and rice, green beans from a can, milk for Miguel, and water for himself. The routine provided structure that Miguel needed and purpose that Samir sometimes struggled to find. Tell me about the Ferrari again, Miguel said without looking up from his math worksheet. This request came at least twice a week, always phrased exactly the same way. Samir paused in his stirring. The Ferrari story was part family legend, part cautionary tale. Which part? The engine part. The part about the design. Samir sat down beside his son, watching him work through multiplication problems with mechanical precision. When I was younger, before you were born, I designed an engine system for a very special car. It was supposed to revolutionize how luxury sports cars worked: more power, better efficiency, smoother operation. But your partner took the credit. Yes, David Chen and I worked together for 3 years on that project. When it was finished, he registered the patents under his name only and sold the design to manufacturers across Europe. The old bitterness had mellowed into something more like resignation. That's how he started Chen Automotive Innovations. That's how he became rich while you became papa to me, Miguel interrupted, still focused on his homework. Which is better than being rich without me. The simple logic of it never failed to surprise Samir. Miguel's autism often gifted him with insights that cut through adult complications straight to emotional truth. Yes, the betrayal had cost him everything: his career, his reputation, his financial security. But it had also led him to Maria, Miguel's mother, who had seen past his wounded pride to the man underneath. Their marriage had been brief but profound, ended by a drunk driver when Miguel was only 4. Across town, in a world that might as well have existed on another planet, Layla Wren stood on the marble terrace of her family's summer estate, watching the sunset paint the ocean in shades of gold and crimson. The view was worth millions, which was appropriate since the house itself had cost nearly that much to build. At 28, Leila possessed the kind of beauty that came from good genetics and unlimited resources: personal trainers, nutritionists, stylists. and cosmetic procedures so subtle they appeared entirely natural. Her dark hair fell in perfect waves over shoulders bare, except for the thin straps of a designer dress that cost more than most people's monthly salary. The estate sprawled across 15 acres of prime coastal real estate, with manicured gardens, an infinity pool, and a 6-car garage that housed her collection of luxury vehicles. Tonight's party, a casual gathering of 50 or so friends and business associates, was winding down on the terrace below her. The sound of laughter and conversation mixed with the distant crash of waves against the rocky shoreline. Layla's phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Car will be ready at 9 a.m. for your drive to the vineyard." She had plans to take the Ferrari on a scenic route to Napa Valley, where she'd spend the weekend at another friend's estate. The Ferrari, a 1,967 250 GT that had cost her father nearly $2 million at auction, was her favorite among her cars, a temperamental beauty that required delicate handling and constant attention. "Leila, darling, there you are." Her mother, Layla Wren, appeared at the terrace doors with the practiced smile of someone who'd spent decades at social events. At 55, Victoria maintained her beauty through the same unlimited resources that shaped her daughter's appearance, though the effort showed more clearly in the tight lines around her eyes. The Hendersons are leaving, and they specifically wanted to say goodbye. Victoria's tone carried the subtle command that Leila had learned to recognize and obey from childhood. In the Wren family, social obligations weren't suggestions, they were requirements. Leila followed her mother back into the house, through rooms filled with museum-quality art and furniture that prioritized appearance over comfort. The Hendersons, not to be confused with Mrs. Henderson, who owned the diner, were old family friends who'd made their fortune in tech before retiring to pursue philanthropy and social climbing. "Leila, you look absolutely radiant," Mrs. Henderson gushed, kissing both of Leila's cheeks. "We were just telling your mother how much we're looking forward to the charity auction next month. You are planning to attend, aren't you?" The charity auction. Another obligation disguised as social opportunity, where wealthy families competed to see who could donate the most money while ensuring their generosity received appropriate recognition. Leila had attended dozens of such events, had given speeches and posed for photographs and written checks that meant nothing to her bank account but generated significant tax benefits. "Of course," Leila replied with practiced enthusiasm. "I'm looking forward to it." But as the Hendersons departed and the last guests filtered away, Leila found herself standing alone in the vast living room, surrounded by evidence of wealth but feeling oddly empty. Tomorrow she would drive to Napa, then return to San Francisco for another week of board meetings and social events and shopping trips that filled time without providing purpose. Her reflection stared back from the floor-to-ceiling windows that faced the ocean, and for a moment she didn't recognize the woman looking back at her. When had she become so polished, so perfect, so utterly predictable? When had her life become a series of obligations performed for an audience that applauded her wealth rather than celebrating her achievements? The Ferrari keys lay on the marble-topped side table where she'd dropped them earlier, their weight familiar in her palm. Tomorrow's drive to Napa represented the closest thing to freedom in her carefully structured existence, 2 hours of curves and coastline, where she could push the car to its limits and feel something approaching genuine emotion. She had no way of knowing that tomorrow's drive would end not in wine country but in a small-town garage, where a man with grease-stained hands and wounded pride would challenge everything she believed about worth, respect, and what it truly meant to fix something that was broken. The morning started perfectly for Layla Wren. The Ferrari purred to life with the distinctive growl that only a vintage Welv could produce, its red paint gleaming in the early sunlight as she pulled out of her family's estate. The coastal highway stretched ahead like a ribbon of possibility, curves hugging cliffsides that dropped away to crashing waves hundreds of feet below. She'd dressed for the drive in clothes that cost more than most people's monthly wages, but looked effortlessly casual. Designer jeans that fit like they'd been tailored specifically for her body, a silk blouse in cream that complemented her olive skin, and Italian leather driving gloves that gripped the wooden steering wheel with practiced ease. Her hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail that had taken her stylist 20 minutes to perfect, achieving that carelessly elegant look that money could buy. The first hour of driving was everything she'd hoped for. The Ferrari responded to her touch like a thoroughbred horse, accelerating through straightaways and gliding through curves with mechanical precision. She felt alive in a way that board meetings and charity luncheons never provided, connected to something real and immediate, and entirely under her control. The trouble started as she approached the small town of Millbrook Bay, where she'd planned to stop for coffee before continuing to wine country. A grinding sound from the engine that hadn't been there moments before, followed by a shudder that ran through the entire vehicle. She downshifted carefully, but the problem was getting worsey metallic screech that made her wince and pull over to the shoulder. Steam began rising from under the hood as she sat in the sudden quiet, her perfect morning dissolving into frustration and disbelief. The Ferrari had been serviced just 2 weeks ago by her family's team of expert mechanics, men who specialized in exotic vehicles and charged accordingly. How could something go wrong so quickly? She called her father's garage first, then the Ferrari dealership in San Francisco, then the independent specialist who'd worked on the car before. Each conversation followed the same pattern: concern, questions she couldn't answer, and finally the admission that they'd need to see the car to diagnose the problem. The nearest authorized Ferrari service center was over 100 miles away, and having the car towed would take hours. That's when she noticed the small blue sign half hidden by coastal sage. Ortega's Auto Repair, all makes and models, fair prices. Below it, hand-painted in smaller letters, "If we can't fix it, you don't pay." Leila stared at the sign with growing indignation. She was stranded in some nowhere town with a $2 million car, reduced to considering help from what was obviously a cut-rate garage that probably specialized in pickup trucks and lawnmowers. But as another 20 minutes passed, with no better options presenting themselves, desperation began overriding pride. The garage sat at the end of a gravel drive, a modest building that had seen better decades. Paint peeled from its metal siding, and the small parking area was cracked and patched. A hand-lettered sign in the window advertised oil changes for $29.99, a price that wouldn't even cover the cost of the synthetic oil her Ferrari required. Samir looked up from the engine he was rebuilding as an expensive car pulled into his lot, its driver clearly lost or confused. He recognized the Ferrari immediately, 250 GT, probably late 60s, worth more than his garage and everything in it combined. The woman who climbed out moved with the kind of unconscious elegance that came from never having to worry about appearances, her clothes and bearing screaming money in a way that made his worn coveralls feel shabby by comparison. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying the crisp diction of private schools and finishing courses. "I'm having some trouble with my car. Do you know where I might find a real mechanic?" The words stung more than they should have. Samir had heard variations of this question before the assumption that a small-town garage couldn't handle anything more complex than changing air filters. But something about her tone, the casual dismissal of his expertise, brought back memories of boardrooms where his ideas had been questioned not because they were wrong, but because of who was presenting them. "I am a real mechanic," he replied quietly, wiping his hands on a shop rag. "What seems to be the problem?" Leila looked around the garage with barely concealed skepticism, taking in the aging equipment and modest setup. "It's a very expensive car. I'm not sure you understand. This isn't some domestic model you can fix with generic parts." "It's a Ferrari," Samir said simply. "Probably a 1967 250 GT based on the body lines and exhaust note I heard when you pulled in. The engine's likely the Colombo 12, which means you're dealing with a complex fuel injection system and timing that requires precise calibration. What symptoms are you experiencing?" The accuracy of his assessment caught Leila off guard. She'd expected vague guesses, not specific technical knowledge. "Well, It started making grinding noises, then began overheating, steam coming from under the hood. Samir nodded, already forming preliminary theories. Mind if I take a look? She hesitated, glancing around the modest garage, as if searching for hidden cameras that might be recording this moment of desperation. I suppose. But I should warn you, this car has been serviced by specialists who've worked on Ferraris for decades. If they couldn't prevent this problem, I'm not sure what you could do about it. The condescension in her voice was unmistakable, delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never considered how her words might affect others. Samir felt something harden in his chest, a familiar wall rising to protect what remained of his professional pride. Well then, he said, his voice carefully neutral, I guess we'll find out. He popped the hood and immediately saw the problem, a coolant leak that had been building slowly, probably for weeks. The overflow tank was empty, and pink residue stained the engine bay where coolant had boiled away. But as he looked closer, he noticed something else. Modifications to the fuel injection system that weren't standard for this model year. Custom work that spoke of serious engineering knowledge. Your specialists missed a slow coolant leak, he announced after several minutes of examination. Probably started as a pinhole in one of the aluminum fittings, but it's been getting worse. When the coolant level dropped far enough, your engine started overheating, which is what caused the grinding you heard, thermal expansion, affecting the pistons. Leila crossed her arms, her expression skeptical. And you can fix this? The leak, yes. But there are other issues. Someone's modified your fuel injection system extensively. This isn't standard Ferrari engineering, it's custom work, and it's sophisticated. Whoever did it knew what they were doing, but it's going to make repairs more complicated. She stared at him as if he'd started speaking a foreign language. That's impossible. This car was completely restored by certified Ferrari technicians. Everything is original. Samir shrugged, pointing to specific components under the hood. See these injectors? They're feeding fuel at a different rate than factory specifications. And this timing system has been completely rebuilt with custom components. It's beautiful work, actually, but it's definitely not original. The certainty in his voice clashed with everything Leila thought she knew about her car. Her father's team had assured her the restoration was complete and authentic, worth every penny of the astronomical sum he'd paid. Even if that were true, could you repair it? Depends on what parts I can source and how extensive the modifications are. I'd need to really dig in to understand what we're dealing with. Samir straightened up, meeting her eyes directly. It would take time, and there are no guarantees. A car this complex, with custom work, frankly, it might be beyond what a small shop like mine can handle. The admission surprised her. She'd expected him to oversell his abilities, to promise quick fixes and easy solutions. Instead, he was being honest about the limitations, which somehow made his expertise seem more credible. How long? She asked. Hard to say without seeing the full extent of the modifications. Could be days, could be weeks. He paused, studying her expression. There's a Ferrari specialist in Mterrey who might be better equipped for this kind of work. I could recommend... No. The word came out sharper than she intended. She'd already called every specialist within driving distance, and none of them could see her for at least a week. If you're willing to try, I'd like you to take a look. Something in her tone had shifted, desperation creeping through the aristocratic confidence. Samir recognized the feeling he'd been there himself, when circumstances forced you to accept help from unexpected sources. All right, he said, but I should warn you I work at my own pace, and I don't make promises I can't keep. If this is beyond my capabilities, I'll tell you honestly. Leila nodded, though part of her couldn't believe she was entrusting her precious Ferrari to a mechanic whose garage looked like it belonged in a different century. Fair enough. What do you need from me? Keys, registration, and patience, Samir replied. I'll call you when I know more. As she walked away, leaving her most prized possession in the hands of a stranger, Leila felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Genuine uncertainty about an outcome she couldn't control with money or connections. Behind her, Samir looked at the Ferrari's engine bay with the focused intensity of a surgeon preparing for a complex operation, unaware that this repair would challenge everything both of them believed about worth, capability, and the distance between different worlds. Samir waited until closing time to begin his real examination of the Ferrari, when the distractions of daily business wouldn't interrupt his focus. The garage felt different in the evening quiet, shadows stretching long across the concrete floor as he wheeled the red machine into the center bay under his brightest work lights. Miguel appeared at his elbow as he opened the hood, drawn by the exotic curves of the car like metal filings to a magnet. The boy's eyes widened as he took in the complexity of the engine bay, his head tilting in that particular way that meant he was processing something fascinating. "Papa, this engine sings differently than normal cars," Miguel observed, running his fingers along the air, cleaner housing without actually touching. "The harmonics are more complex, like a choir instead of a single voice." Samir smiled at his son's description. Miguel's autism gave him an unusual sensitivity to mechanical sounds and vibrations, often allowing him to diagnose problems that escaped traditional methods. "What else do you notice?" "The fuel injectors aren't Ford or GM. They're custom machined, probably from billet aluminum. And the timing system," Miguel paused, studying the engine with intense concentration. "Papa, this looks like the drawings in your desk." The words hit Samir like a physical blow. He followed Miguel's pointing finger to the fuel rail assembly, and his breath caught. The design was unmistakably elegant lines that maximized fuel flow, while minimizing pressure drop, manufactured with tolerances that required specialized equipment to achieve. He'd sketched those exact specifications 15 years ago, working late nights in his apartment while dreaming of revolutionary automotive engineering. With trembling hands, he pulled out his phone's flashlight and examined the component more carefully. There, barely visible on the underside, were the initials SO etched in tiny letter's signature on the original prototype. The implications crashed over him like a cold wave. This wasn't just any Ferrari. This was the test vehicle for his stolen engine management system, the proof of concept that David Chen had used to launch his empire. The car that had made millionaires of men who'd taken credit for Samir's work while he struggled to rebuild his life in a small-town garage. "Miguel, can you get my old portfolio from the office? The blue folder in the bottom drawer." As his son retrieved the portfolio, Samir continued his examination with growing amazement and anger. Every custom component bore the fingerprints of his original design, philosophied approach to fuel delivery that had revolutionized performance engineering, the timing algorithms that had become industry standard, the cooling modifications that had solved problems other engineers hadn't even recognized. Miguel returned with the folder, its contents yellowed with age but still clearly detailed. Samir spread the technical drawings across his workbench, comparing them to the engine in front of him. The match was perfect, down to the smallest specifications. "These are your drawings, Papa," Miguel said, his voice carrying the certainty of someone who noticed patterns others missed. "But they're in that lady's car. How did your drawings get in her car?" The explanation would have to wait. Footsteps on gravel announced a visitor, and Samir looked up to see Layla Wren walking through the open garage door. She'd changed from her morning outfit into more casual clothes, though casual for her still meant designer jeans and a sweater that probably cost more than his monthly rent. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by," she said, her voice carrying less of the imperious tone from earlier. "I was curious about your progress, and I admit I'm not used to being without transportation." Samir quickly closed the portfolio, unsure how to process what he'd discovered, or whether to share it with the woman whose family had unknowingly profited from his stolen work. "Actually, I was just getting started with the real diagnosis. Would you like to see what we're dealing with?" She approached the engine bay with obvious appreciation for the machinery, her eyes taking in details that most people would miss. "It's beautiful, isn't it? My father bought this car at auction 3 years ago. The seller claimed it was a unique prototype with custom engineering that made it incredibly valuable. Your father knows cars. He's been collecting them for decades. Classic Ferraris are his specialty. He says they represent the perfect marriage of art and engineering. Leila leaned closer to examine the fuel rail assembly. He had his restoration team go over every component to ensure authenticity. They assured him everything was original factory work. Samir felt a bitter laugh building in his chest. Not everything. See this fuel delivery system? The injectors, the pressure regulators, the timing controls. This is all custom work, probably done in the late 2000s. Whoever designed it was a hell of an engineer, but it's definitely not 1967 Ferrari engineering. That's impossible. My father's team would have noticed modifications like that. Not if they didn't know what to look for. This work is so sophisticated, it could pass for factory engineering to most people. But I recognize the design philosophy. He paused, wrestling with how much to reveal. I've seen work like this before. Miguel, who had been listening with the intense focus he brought to all technical discussions, suddenly spoke up. Papa, why don't you tell her about the man who stole your drawings? The words hung in the air like smoke from a backfiring engine. Leila looked between father and son, confusion evident in her expression. What drawings? Samir shot his son a warning look, but Miguel's autism made reading social cues difficult. The boy continued with the logical directness that was both his gift and his challenge. Papa designed engine systems like this one before I was born, but his partner took all the credit and became rich while Papa had to move here and fix other people's cars instead of designing new ones. The garage fell silent, except for the distant sound of waves against the rocky shore. Leila stared at Samir with new understanding. Pieces of a puzzle she hadn't known existed, beginning to form a picture that made her deeply uncomfortable. Is that true? She asked quietly. Samir considered lying, maintaining the fiction of the humble small-town mechanic. But Miguel's innocent honesty had stripped away his defenses, and the evidence was literally spread out before them on his workbench. It was a long time ago, he said finally. Another life. But you really were an automotive engineer? You designed systems like what's in my car. I designed systems exactly like what's in your car. The admission came out harder than he intended, years of suppressed bitterness coloring his voice. The question is how my work ended up in a Ferrari that your father bought at auction. Leila felt something cold settling in her stomach. Her father's collection represented decades of careful acquisition, each vehicle researched and authenticated by experts. If what Samir was suggesting was truth, her family had unknowingly bought stolen intellectual property. The implications went far beyond one man's hurt feelings. Could you prove it? She asked. If what you're saying is accurate, could you demonstrate that you designed these modifications? Samir looked at his son, who was watching the adult conversation with the intense attention he gave to mechanical problems. Miguel's drawings covered the office wall sketches of engine configurations that reflected inherited genius, the next generation of innovation waiting to be nurtured or crushed by circumstances beyond his control. Yes, Samir said simply. I could prove it. The question is whether you want me to. Leila spent that night in the town's only decent hotel, a modest bed and breakfast that catered to tourists seeking coastal charm on a budget. Her usual accommodations featured marble bathrooms and Egyptian cotton sheets, but the Rose Inn offered clean rooms and honest hospitality luxuries she was beginning to understand differently. She couldn't stop thinking about Samir's portfolio, the technical drawings that seemed to match her Ferrari's modifications with disturbing precision. Part of her wanted to dismiss his claims as the fantasies of a bitter man whose career had somehow gone wrong. But the specificity of his knowledge, the way he'd identified components that her father's expensive restoration team had missed, suggested expertise that couldn't be faked. The next morning, she returned to the garage earlier than planned, arriving just as Samir was helping Miguel board the school bus. She watched from her rental car as father and son went through what was obviously a daily ritual, Samir checking Miguel's backpack, Miguel reciting his schedule for the day, both of them sharing a moment of connection that spoke of deep love and careful routine. "How long have you been raising him alone?" she asked as Samir walked back toward the garage. 8 years. His mother died when he was 4. The words carried matter-of-fact grief, the kind that had been worn smooth by time but never fully healed. Miguel's autism makes some things challenging, but he sees the world in ways that constantly amaze me. Leila followed him inside, where her Ferrari sat under work lights like a patient on an operating table. During the night, Samir had begun disassembling the fuel delivery system, laying out components with surgical precision on clean shop towels. Each piece was labeled and organized, the methodical approach of someone who understood that complex problems required systematic solutions. "I've been thinking about what you said yesterday," she began carefully, "about recognizing the design work. If you really did create these modifications, wouldn't there be records? Patents, documentation, something that would prove your claims?" Samir's expression darkened. There were records. David Chen made sure they all bore his name as primary inventor. I was listed as a consulting engineer on some of the early paperwork, but by the time the patents were filed, I'd been written out of the history. That seems like something you could have challenged legally. With what resources? David had a team of corporate lawyers and unlimited funding. I had a sick wife, mounting medical bills, and a son who needed stability more than I needed vindication. Samir picked up a fuel injector, examining it under a magnifying glass. Sometimes you have to choose between being right and surviving. The bitterness in his voice made Leila uncomfortable, forcing her to confront the reality of what legal battles cost for people without trust funds and family connections. She'd grown up in a world where lawyers were tools you deployed to solve problems, not luxury items beyond reach. "Show me," she said suddenly. "Show me how you know this is your work." Samir set down the injector and pulled out his portfolio again, spreading the technical drawings across the workbench. "This is the original fuel rail design," he said, pointing to a detailed schematic. "See these calculations for pressure drop across the injector array? The math assumes a specific flow rate and fuel density that wouldn't be standard for a 1967 Ferrari. He moved to the actual component, pointing out features that matched the drawing exactly. But if you were designing for modern high-octane fuel with different chemical properties, these specifications would be perfect. The entire system is engineered around assumptions that didn't exist in the 1960s. Leila studied the drawings, her art history education, helping her recognize the sophisticated draftsmanship. These weren't rough sketches, they were professional engineering documents, complete with precise measurements and mathematical calculations that spoke of deep technical knowledge. "The timing system is even more obvious," Samir continued, moving to another drawing. "This approach to ignition mapping was revolutionary when I developed it. Instead of fixed timing curves, it uses dynamic adjustment based on real-time engine conditions. The algorithm took me 2 years to perfect." He pointed to a small electronic module buried deep in the engine bay. "That's the control unit. If I'm right, it contains code that I wrote 15 years ago. Code that has my particular approach to handling edge cases in the timing calculations. Could you access it? Read the programming?" "With the right equipment, yes, but that would mean partially disassembling your engine, and there's always risk involved in that kind of work." Samir paused, studying her face. "I have to ask, why does this matter to you? Even if everything I'm saying is true, it doesn't change the fact that your father bought this car in good faith. You're not responsible for what happened to me." The question struck deeper than Leila expected. Why did it matter? She could have the car towed to a Ferrari specialist, pay whatever it cost to repair, and return to her life of comfortable certainty. But something about Samir's story, the quiet dignity with which he'd accepted his losses, the way he'd built a life around caring for his son, despite professional devastation, had awakened something in her that money couldn't satisfy. Because if you're telling the truth, then you've been cheated out of recognition for work that changed an entire industry. And if you're not telling the truth, then I need to understand why someone with your obvious expertise ended up in a small-town garage fixing pickup trucks. Samir was quiet for a long moment, surprised by her directness. "You really want to know?" "I really want to know." He pulled a framed photograph from his desk drawer, a picture of himself in a suit, standing beside a sleek prototype vehicle at what was obviously an auto show or industry event. The man in the photo looked confident, successful, surrounded by the trappings of professional achievement. "That was taken at the Frankfurt Motor Show in 2009, he said. "6 months before David Chen's lawyers informed me that I had no legal claim to the work I'd spent 3 years developing. By then, the patents were filed, the licensing deals were signed, and the technology was being integrated into luxury vehicles across Europe. What did you do?" "I fought for 2 years, spent everything I had on legal fees, trying to prove what I knew was true. David's team buried me in paperwork, delayed every hearing, made the process so expensive and time-consuming that I eventually had to choose between continuing the fight and caring for my family." He returned the photograph to the drawer, closing it with careful precision. Maria was diagnosed with cancer around the same time. Miguel needed stability and support, not a father who was consumed with bitterness and legal battles. So I let it go. Took what work I could find, moved here when the money ran out, and tried to build something good from what was left. The story hung between them, decades of disappointment and compromise distilled into a few quiet sentences. Leila found herself thinking about her own life, about the ease with which problems disappeared when you had unlimited resources to throw at them. "I'm sorry," she said, meaning it more than she'd expected to. "Don't be. Good things came from the bad. I met Maria because of the stress. She was a social worker helping me navigate Miguel's early diagnosis. Miguel himself, he's taught me more about what matters than any engineering project ever could." As if summoned by his father's words, Miguel appeared in the garage doorway, backpack in hand and expression serious. "Papa, the bus driver says his transmission is getting worse. I think we should look at it before it fails completely." He noticed Leila and added with characteristic directness, "Hello, Ferrari lady. Is Papa fixing your car with his stolen drawings?" The innocent question broke the tension that had been building, forcing both adults to confront the strange situation they'd created. Here was a 12-year-old boy who understood complex mechanical systems but had no filter for social awkwardness, asking the question that neither adult wanted to answer directly. "We're working on it, Miguel," Samir said gently. "Why don't you start your homework, and I'll check on Mr. Rodriguez's transmission when I get a chance." As Miguel disappeared upstairs, Leila looked at the partially disassembled Ferrari and realized she'd crossed some invisible line. She was no longer just a customer seeking repair service. She was a participant in a story that stretched back years before she'd ever heard of Samir Ortega, with implications that reached far beyond getting her car running again. Over the next 3 days, Leila found herself spending more time at the garage than she'd ever spent anywhere that didn't feature marble floors and vaulted ceilings. She told herself she was monitoring progress on her car, but the truth was more complicated. She was fascinated by the rhythm of Samir's work, the way he approached each component with patience and respect that bordered on reverence. "Hand me that torque wrench," he said on Wednesday afternoon, deep in the process of removing the fuel rail assembly. His request was automatic, the kind of direction you'd give to an experienced assistant. Leila looked at the array of tools spread across his workbench, overwhelmed by the variety of wrenches, pliers, and devices whose purposes she couldn't begin to guess. "Which one?" Samir glanced up, taking in her confusion with a slight smile. "The one that looks like a regular wrench but has a gauge on the handle. It measures how tight you're making a bolt, critical when you're working with aluminum components that can crack if you over-tighten them." She found the tool and handed it to him, watching as he adjusted the setting with practiced ease. "How do you know exactly how tight each bolt should be?" "Experience, mostly, but also because I designed this system, I know the stress tolerances of every component." He began working on the fuel rail, his movements precise and economical. "This particular assembly requires 45 foot-pounds of torque. Too loose and you get fuel leaks. Too tight and you crack the housing. Could you teach me?" The question surprised them both. Leila had spoken without thinking, driven by curiosity she hadn't known she possessed. Samir studied her face, looking for signs of condescension or amusement, but found only genuine interest. "It's not exactly clean work," he warned, gesturing to his grease-stained coveralls. "I can handle dirty." She looked down at her designer clothes and laughed. "Well, maybe not in this outfit, but I could change." The next morning, she appeared in jeans and a t-shirt that had obviously been purchased the night before, the creases from packaging still visible, the fit slightly wrong for someone who usually wore custom-tailored clothing. But her willingness to look awkward, to step outside the polished perfection that seemed to define her, touched something in Samir that he'd thought was permanently closed off. "Rule number 1, he said, handing her a pair of safety glasses, "respect the machinery. Cars can hurt you if you're careless. Pinch points, sharp edges, chemicals that can burn your skin. Stay focused and think before you move. Rule number 2, clean as you go. A messy workspace leads to lost tools and mistakes." He guided her to the workbench, where the Ferrari's fuel system lay in organized pieces. "See how each component has its own space. That's not just for show, it's how you keep track of what goes where when it's time to reassemble." Leila picked up one of the fuel injectors, surprised by its weight and the precision of its machining. The component felt substantial in her hands, engineered with tolerances that spoke of serious money and sophisticated manufacturing. "This single part probably costs more than most people spend on an entire car," she observed. "About $800 each, and your engine has 12 of them." Samir took the injector and pointed out features that weren't obvious to untrained eyes. "But look at the craftsmanship. See how the fuel inlet is perfectly aligned with the spray pattern. That geometry took months to optimize." He began cleaning the injector with a specialized solvent, his movements gentle despite his calloused hands. "When I was developing this system, I must have tested 50 different configurations before settling on this design. Each one required new calculations, new prototypes, new testing. What made this version special? Efficiency, mostly. Traditional fuel injection systems waste a lot of energy. They operate at constant pressure, regardless of what the engine actually needs. This design adjusts fuel delivery in real time based on throttle position, engine temperature, air density, even the chemical composition of the fuel itself." As he explained the system's operation, Leila found herself drawn into the elegance of the engineering. She'd grown up around beautiful objects, paintings, sculptures, handcrafted jewelry, but had never considered mechanical systems as art. Now she began to see the aesthetic dimension of Samir's work, the way form followed function in patterns that were both practical and beautiful. "Try cleaning this one," he said, handing her another injector and a soft brush. "Gentle pressure, you're removing carbon deposits, not trying to scrub paint off a wall." Her first attempts were clumsy, the brush awkward in her manicured hands. But Samir's patient instruction helped her find the right technique, and gradually she developed a rhythm that was oddly satisfying. There was something meditative about the work, a focus that quieted the constant mental chatter that usually filled her days. "Why did you give up engineering?" she asked as they worked together in companionable silence. "I didn't give it up. It was taken from me." The bitterness in his voice had softened over the days they'd spent together, replaced by something closer to resignation. "After the legal battles ended, I was effectively blacklisted. David's connections ran deep in the industry. No major manufacturer would hire someone who'd challenged his patents, even if my claims were valid. So you ended up here." "Not immediately. I spent 2 years taking whatever work I could find, consulting jobs that paid by the day, contract work that ended when budgets got tight. But Maria was sick. Miguel needed stability, and eventually the money ran out. This place was what I could afford." Leila looked around the modest garage, trying to imagine the adjustment from corporate engineering to small-town auto repair. "Do you miss it? The prestige, the cutting-edge projects?" Samir considered the question while examining an injector for damage. "I miss the creative challenge. There's something addictive about solving problems that haven't been solved before, pushing the boundaries of what's possible. But I don't miss the politics, the corporate games, the way good ideas got buried because they threatened someone's quarterly profits. He set down the injector and looked directly at her. What about you? Do you miss anything about your life before this? The question caught her off guard. Before what? Before you got stranded in a small town with a broken-down Ferrari and started learning about fuel injection systems. She considered the question seriously, realizing that she couldn't remember the last time someone had asked her about her inner life rather than her plans or preferences or opinions on topics that didn't really matter. I miss the certainty, she said finally. In my world, problems have solutions you can buy. If something breaks, you call an expert. If you want something, you purchase it. If you're unhappy, you travel somewhere else, or buy something new, or change your environment until the feeling goes away. And now I'm learning that some problems can't be fixed with money, some expertise can't be purchased. Some satisfaction has to be earned through work that makes your hands dirty and your back ache. She held up the injector she'd been cleaning, examining her work with critical eyes. Is this clean enough? Samir inspected the component, noting the care she'd taken to remove every trace of carbon buildup. That's professional. Quality work. You could do this for a living. The compliment meant more to her than awards she'd received for charity work or praise from society magazines. This was recognition based on skill rather than status, approval earned through effort rather than purchased with donations. Samir, she said, setting down her tools, I need to tell you something about my family, about our business connections. He looked up from his work, alerted by the seriousness in her tone. My father doesn't just collect cars. He's on the board of directors for 3 major automotive companies. He has business relationships with manufacturers across Europe and Asia. She paused, gathering courage for what came next. Including Chen Automotive Innovations. The words hung in the air between them like smoke from an overheated engine. Samir's expression didn't change, but she saw something shift behind his eyes, a recalculation of who she. The revelation about her family's connection to David Chen hung between them like a physical barrier. Samir set down his tools with deliberate care, his expression unreadable as he processed this new information. How long have you known? He asked quietly. I suspected after our first conversation about your stolen work. I made some calls, did some research. Layla's voice carried the weight of uncomfortable truths. My father's been doing business with Chen Automotive for over a decade. They've licensed technology for several luxury vehicle projects, including modifications that are probably based on your original designs. Samir felt something cold settle in his chest. Not only had his work been stolen, but the woman whose car he was repairing came from a family that had profited from that theft, however unknowingly. The irony was so complete it bordered on cruel. Does your father know about me? About what happened with the patents? I don't think so. These business relationships are managed by lawyers and executives. Dad focuses on the collecting side. He probably never knew there was any controversy about the technology's origins. She paused, studying his face. But I could ask him. I could find out exactly what they know. And then what? Even if your father learned the truth, what would that change? David's patents are still valid, the licensing deals are still in place, and I'm still fixing cars in a small-town garage while other people profit from my work. The bitterness in his voice had returned, sharper now because the wound had been reopened. Leila watched him struggle with emotions that years of careful control couldn't quite suppress. It would change things for me, she said softly. I can't unknow what I know now. I can't go back to thinking of you as just another mechanic, or of my family's wealth as something that exists in isolation from the rest of the world. Her honesty surprised him. He'd expected defensiveness, justifications, perhaps anger at being made to feel guilty about circumstances beyond her control. Instead, she seemed to be wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Your family didn't steal anything, he said finally. They're just part of a system that rewards people who are good at claiming credit for other people's work. That doesn't make it right. No, but it makes it complicated. Fighting the system requires resources I don't have and probably wouldn't accomplish anything meaningful anyway. He picked up another fuel injector, examining it for wear. Sometimes the best revenge is just doing good work and raising your son to be a better man than the people who wronged you. Miguel chose that moment to appear in the garage doorway, home from school, and immediately drawn to the disassembled Ferrari like a moth to flame. He set down his backpack with characteristic precision and approached the workbench where Leila was cleaning components. "You're getting better at that," he observed, watching her technique with the critical eye of someone who appreciated mechanical precision. "Your brush strokes are more consistent than yesterday." "Thank you," Leila replied, genuinely pleased by his assessment. Over the past few days, she'd grown fond of Miguel's direct communication style, finding his honesty refreshing after a lifetime of social pleasantries. "Miguel, can you show Leila how to check the injector spray patterns?" Samir asked, clearly seeking a distraction from their difficult conversation. "She's been doing excellent work on the cleaning." Miguel's face lit up with the enthusiasm he brought to all mechanical challenges. He retrieved a specialized testing device from the tool cabinet equipment that seemed sophisticated for a small-town garage, but made sense given Samir's background. "First, you mount the injector in the test fixture," he explained to Leila, his voice taking on the careful cadence he used when teaching complex concepts. "Then you pressurize the fuel system and activate the solenoid. The spray pattern should be perfectly symmetrical. If it's not, the injector is damaged and needs replacement." As Leila followed his instructions, Miguel continued his commentary with the technical precision that made him such an effective diagnostic tool. This particular injector design creates a 40-degree cone spray pattern with atomization particles averaging 12 microns in diameter. "Papa says that's optimal for fuel efficiency in high-performance applications." "How do you know all this?" Leila asked, genuinely amazed by the boy's knowledge. "Papa teaches me, and I read his old engineering books. Also, I can hear when engines aren't running correctly. The sound frequencies tell you what's wrong if you know how to listen." Miguel adjusted the test equipment with practiced ease. Most people don't pay attention to mechanical sounds, but they contain enormous amounts of diagnostic information. Watching Miguel work, Leila began to understand something about the family she'd stumbled into. This wasn't just a father and son getting by in difficult circumstances. This was a legacy being passed down, knowledge and passion being transmitted from one generation to the next, despite the obstacles they faced. "Miguel," she said carefully, "what do you want to do when you grow up?" "Design engines like Papa did, but better. I want to create systems that are more efficient and produce fewer emissions while maintaining optimal performance characteristics." His answer came without hesitation, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd thought deeply about his future. "Also, I want to help other kids like me understand that being different doesn't mean being less capable." The simple statement hit Leila like a physical blow. Here was a 12-year-old boy who'd inherited his father's genius and faced his own challenges, yet possessed a clarity of purpose that she'd never experienced despite all her advantages. "That sounds like an excellent plan," she managed to say. "Papa says I can't do it without good education, though. The engineering programs at universities are very competitive, and they're expensive. But Papa's saving money every month, so I can apply when I'm ready." Samir looked up from his work, embarrassment coloring his expression. "Miguel, we don't need to discuss our finances with—" "It's okay, Papa. Leila knows we don't have much money. She's not stupid." Miguel's blunt assessment carried no judgment, just factual observation. "Besides, she's learning to be a mechanic now, so she's practically family." The word family settled over them with unexpected weight. Leila realized that somewhere in the process of learning to clean fuel injectors and understand engine management systems, she'd been absorbed into something she'd never experienced before: relationship based on shared work rather than social obligation. "Miguel's right," she said, meeting Samir's eyes. "I am learning to be a mechanic. And I'm learning other things too, about what it means to build something with your hands, about how expertise really develops, about what happens when good people face unfair circumstances. She set down her tools and wiped her hands on a shop rag, a gesture that would have horrified her mother but felt natural now. I want to help, not with money, I know that would complicate things, but I have resources, connections, information that might be useful. If you're willing to let me. Samir studied her face, looking for signs of pity or condescension. But what he saw was something he hadn't expected: genuine respect, mixed with a determination that reminded him of his younger self, back when he'd believed that hard work and good intentions could overcome any obstacle. "What did you have in mind?" he asked. "I'm not sure yet, but I know people who know people, and sometimes the right introduction or conversation can open doors that seemed permanently closed." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "I also know that Miguel's right about education being expensive, and I know that genius like yours shouldn't be limited by circumstances you can't control." Miguel looked between the two adults with the intensity he brought to mechanical problems, processing social dynamics with the same analytical approach he used to diagnose engine issues. "Are you going to help Papa get his credit back for the stolen designs?" he asked Leila directly. "I'm going to try," she replied, meaning it more completely than she'd meant anything in years. Outside the garage, the coastal wind carried the salt scent of evening tides, and somewhere in the distance, a ship's horn sounded its lonely call. But inside, under the bright work lights, three people from vastly different worlds continued the careful process of rebuilding something that had been broken, not just a Ferrari's engine, but trust between strangers who were becoming something more. The breakthrough came on a Friday evening when Samir finally accessed the Ferrari's engine control unit. Using diagnostic equipment he'd borrowed from a friend at the community college, he connected to the ECU's memory banks and began downloading the software that governed the engine's operation. This could take a while. He warned Leila and Miguel, who had both insisted on staying to witness this moment of truth. "The code is encrypted, and I'll need time to analyze the algorithms." But as the data streamed across his laptop screen, Samir's expression changed from cautious optimism to stunned recognition. The programming structure was unmistakably his, not just similar to his work, but containing actual code segments he'd written 15 years ago. Comments embedded in the software bore his distinctive style, including inside jokes and references that only he would have used. "This is impossible," he whispered, scrolling through lines of code that felt like reading his own diary from another lifetime. "What's impossible?" Leila asked, leaning over his shoulder to peer at the screen. "This isn't just technology based on my work. This is my actual code, including development notes I never shared with anyone." His hands trembled slightly as he navigated through the software architecture. "But there's more. Here are modifications I didn't write. Improvements to the original algorithms." Miguel, who had been watching the screen with characteristic intensity, suddenly pointed to a section of code near the bottom of the file. "Papa, look at the timestamp on that subroutine. It was modified in 2019. Samir followed his son's finger to the date stamp, and the implications hit him like a physical blow. "Someone's been actively developing this system for years after I thought it was finished. They've been building on my work, improving it, and I had no idea." "Who would have access to your original code?" Leila asked. "David Chen, obviously, but also—" Samir paused, his mind racing through possibilities. There were 3 other engineers on the project team. If one of them kept copies of the development files. He pulled out his phone and began searching through old contacts, looking for names he hadn't thought about in years. Most of the numbers were disconnected, but finally he found one that still worked: Marcus Webb, a software engineer who'd been responsible for the control system's user interface. The conversation was awkward at first, 2 former colleagues reconnecting across a gulf of lost careers and bitter memories. But as Samir explained what he'd discovered, Marcus's voice grew increasingly agitated. "Jesus, Samir, I've been wondering when someone would figure this out," Marcus said, his voice crackling through the phone speaker. I've been working for Chen Automotive for the past 8 years, maintaining and updating the engine management systems they license to manufacturers. Maintaining my code? Your code, my interface improvements, Sarah Chen's diagnostic routines, the whole team's work, actually. David's been presenting it as his own development for over a decade, but most of the innovation came from the original team. Marcus paused, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of years of suppressed guilt. I kept copies of everything, Samir. Every development file, every email thread, every design review. I told myself it was just professional archive material, but really I was waiting for someone to challenge David's version of history. The revelation recontextualized everything Samir thought he knew about his stolen work. Not only had his original designs been appropriated, but they'd been actively developed and improved by people who knew the truth about their origins. Marcus, would you be willing to testify about this? To provide documentation proving the real development timeline? I've been hoping someone would ask me that question for 8 years. Yes, absolutely. I have a server full of evidence that would make David Chen's lawyers very nervous. After ending the call, Samir sat in stunned silence, processing the magnitude of what they'd discovered. This wasn't just about reclaiming credit for old work, it was about exposing a systematic fraud that had continued for over a decade. Papa, Miguel said quietly, does this mean you can get your job back? The innocent question highlighted the complexity of their situation. Even with proof of the original theft, even with evidence of ongoing fraud, the legal and professional challenges were enormous. David Chen's empire was built on stolen foundations, but it was also worth hundreds of millions of dollars and employed thousands of people. It's complicated, son, but it means we have options we didn't have before. Leila, who had been silent during the phone conversation, finally spoke up. There's something else you need to know, something I discovered about my family's connection to all this. She pulled out her own phone, showing them a series of emails she'd exchanged with her father's business manager. I had them research our licensing agreements with Chen Automotive, looking for any irregularities or unusual terms. What did you find? Your Ferrari isn't just any prototype vehicle. It's the specific car that David Chen used to demonstrate his revolutionary engine management system to potential investors and licensing partners. She scrolled through the documentation, highlighting key passages. My father's company was one of the first to license the technology, and they paid a premium because David convinced them they were getting exclusive access to breakthrough innovations. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with sickening clarity. Not only had David stolen Samir's work, but he'd used it to defraud investors and licensing partners, generating millions in revenue based on false claims about the technology's origins. Leila, Samir said carefully, your family was victimized by this fraud, just as much as I was. Maybe more, they actually paid money for technology that was obtained through theft. That's what I've been thinking about. If we can prove that David's patents were fraudulently obtained, then all the licensing agreements based on those patents would be invalid. Companies like my father's would have grounds to demand refunds, to partner directly with the technology's actual creator. The implications were staggering. If they could expose the truth about the stolen patents, it wouldn't just vindicate, Samir would potentially unravel David Chen's entire business empire, while creating opportunities for legitimate partnerships with the people who'd been defrauded. Miguel, who had been following the adult conversation with his characteristic attention to detail, suddenly spoke up with the logical directness that cut through complex problems. So if Papa created the technology, and David stole it, and companies paid David for technology that wasn't really his, then those companies should pay Papa instead, right? That's actually a pretty accurate summary of the legal situation, Leila said, impressed by the boy's grasp of the complexities involved. But there's still the question of proof, Samir pointed out. Even with Marcus's files and the evidence in your car's computer, David's lawyers will argue that he's the legitimate patent holder. Legal ownership and moral ownership aren't always the same thing. Leila stood up and walked to the garage's open door, looking out at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. When she turned back to face them, her expression carried a determination that reminded Samir of his younger self, back when he'd believed that truth and hard work were sufficient to overcome any obstacle. What if we didn't have to prove it in court? What if we could demonstrate it publicly, in a way that would be impossible for David to discredit or dismiss? What do you mean? The Mterrey Classic Car Show is next month. It's the biggest automotive event on the West Coast. Manufacturers, collectors, journalists, industry executives, everyone who matters in the luxury car world. She paused, her mind working through the logistics. What if we brought your Ferrari there, completely restored with all its original innovations functioning perfectly, and you demonstrated the technology yourself? Showed the world that you understand the system well enough to rebuild it from scratch? Samir felt his heart rate accelerating. The idea was audacious, potentially brilliant, and completely terrifying. That would require finishing the restoration, documenting everything we've discovered, and preparing a presentation that would convince industry professionals that I'm telling the truth about work I did 15 years ago. Could you do it? He looked at the partially disassembled Ferrari, then at his son's hopeful face, then at Layla's determined expression. For the first time in years, he felt something he'd almost forgotten: the excitement of a technical challenge that could change everything. With the right help, yes, I could do it. Miguel clapped his hands together with excitement, the gesture unusually demonstrative for him. Papa, this is like solving the world's most complicated engine problem. That's exactly what it is, Samir replied, smiling for the first time since the phone call with Marcus. The world's most complicated engine problem, with consequences that could reshape an entire industry. Outside, the coastal fog was beginning to roll in from the ocean, wrapping the small town in soft grey mystery. But inside the garage, under the bright work lights, three unlikely partners began planning what would either be a spectacular vindication or an equally spectacular failure, knowing that either outcome was preferable to the quiet desperation of accepting injustice as permanent. The 3 weeks that followed were a whirlwind of activity that transformed the modest garage into something resembling a high-tech engineering laboratory. Leila had used her connections to acquire specialized equipment, while Marcus Webb had quietly shipped boxes of archive development files from his home office in Silicon Valley. The Ferrari sat in the center bay like a patient receiving intensive care, surrounded by diagnostic computers, precision measuring devices, and documentation that told the true story of its revolutionary technology. Samir found himself working 18-hour days, driven by an energy he hadn't felt since his original development work 15 years earlier. Every component of the engine management system was being meticulously restored, documented, and tested to demonstrate not just that the car functioned, but that he understood every aspect of its operation well enough to rebuild it from first principles. The fuel pressure regulator is reading point, 3 bar higher than specification, Miguel announced from his position at the diagnostic computer. His role had evolved from curious observer to essential team member, his ability to detect subtle anomalies, making him invaluable for the fine-tuning process. That's within tolerance for the altitude compensation algorithm, Samir replied, adjusting a microscopic setting on the fuel rail. At sea level, the system automatically reduces pressure to maintain optimal atomization ratios. Leila, who had become surprisingly adept at component assembly, looked up from the ignition timing module she was calibrating. Should I document this adjustment in the demonstration notes? Definitely. The judges at Mterrey will want to understand not just what the system does, but why each design decision was made. Samir paused in his work, wiping sweat from his forehead. This is the level of detail that separated my original approach from conventional engineering. Every component was optimized for the specific application, not just selected from existing options. The demonstration they were preparing would be unlike anything attempted at a classic car show. Rather than simply displaying a beautiful vehicle, they would be presenting a technical seminar that proved Samir's mastery of revolutionary automotive technology. Industry experts would be able to examine every aspect of the system, ask detailed questions, and verify that the modifications represented genuine innovation rather than clever marketing. Layla's phone rang, interrupting their work. The caller ID showed her father's number, and she answered with the slight tension that had characterized their conversations since she'd begun spending her days in a small-town garage. "Leila, darling, I've been hearing the most interesting rumors." William Wren's voice carried the mixture of amusement and concern that she'd learned to interpret as paternal worry disguised as casual interest. "Something about you preparing to make accusations against David Chen at the Mterrey show." "Not accusations, Dad. Demonstrations. We're going to prove that the technology David's been licensing was actually developed by someone else." "Someone else being this mechanic you've been working with." "Leila, I understand you're going through some kind of phase, but making public allegations about patent fraud is serious business. David Chen's lawyers could destroy you financially just for the entertainment value." The conversation continued for several minutes, with her father alternating between gentle persuasion and barely veiled threats about the consequences of challenging established business relationships. When she finally ended the call, Leila felt drained, but more determined than ever. "Trouble?" Samir asked, reading her expression. "My father's concerned that we're going to embarrass the family by publicly challenging David Chen. He's also worried about the business implications if we prove that Chen's patents are fraudulent. It could invalidate millions of dollars in licensing agreements, including agreements that your family's companies have signed. Especially those agreements. Dad's been doing business with Chen Automotive for over a decade. If we prove that the technology was stolen, he'll have to decide whether to demand refunds, renegotiate terms, or find new suppliers." Leila sat down heavily on a workstool. "I'm asking him to choose between family loyalty and business convenience, and that's not a choice he's ever had to make before." Miguel, who had been listening to their conversation while continuing his diagnostic work, offered his perspective with characteristic directness. "Your father should want to do business with Papa instead of the man who stole Papa's work. Papa's technology is better, and Papa is nicer." The simple logic of it made Leila smile despite her stress. "You're absolutely right, Miguel, but adults often make decisions based on things other than logic and niceness." "That's stupid," Miguel declared, then returned his attention to the computer screen where fuel injection patterns danced in precise geometric formations. Over the following days, word of their planned demonstration began spreading through automotive circles with the viral intensity that controversial news achieves in specialized communities. Marcus Webb had quietly contacted several former colleagues, sharing just enough information to generate curiosity without revealing the full scope of their evidence. Automotive journalists began making inquiries, and at least 3 major manufacturers expressed interest in attending their presentation. The attention also attracted less welcome interest. David Chen's office called twice, ostensibly to discuss licensing opportunities, but clearly fishing for information about their intentions. Samir refused both calls, but the messages grew progressively more aggressive, culminating in a thinly veiled legal threat about protecting intellectual property rights. "He's scared," Marcus observed during one of their evening planning sessions. "David's built his entire empire on the foundation of your stolen work. If that foundation crumbles, everything else comes down with it." "How scared should we be of his lawyers?" Leila asked. "Very scared, but not for the reasons you might think. David's legal team is excellent at intimidation and delay tactics, but they have a fundamental problem. The truth isn't on their side. If we can present our evidence clearly and publicly, they'll have a hard time discrediting it without admitting that they've known about the fraud all along." The Ferrari's restoration was nearing completion, its engine running with the smooth precision that only perfect engineering could achieve. But the real test would come at Mterrey, where they would have to demonstrate the technology's capabilities in front of the most knowledgeable audience in the automotive world. "I've been thinking about the presentation format," Samir said, reviewing their plans for what felt like the 100th time. We need to show not just that the car works, but that I understand it well enough to have created it. The best way to do that is to demonstrate real-time adjustments to the engine management system. What kind of adjustments? Leila asked. Performance optimization based on environmental conditions. The Mterrey Peninsula has unique atmospheric characteristics: marine layer humidity, temperature variations, altitude changes. I can show how the system adapts to these conditions automatically, then manually override the algorithms to demonstrate even better performance. Miguel looked up from his homework, which he'd been completing at a workbench between his diagnostic duties. Papa, could you also show them the failure modes? How the system behaves when components start wearing out. That's brilliant, Miguel. Most engineers only demonstrate optimal performance, but showing how gracefully the system degrades under stress would prove intimate knowledge of the design philosophy. As the date of the Mterrey show approached, their small garage had become a hub of activity that attracted curious neighbors and unexpected visitors. Mrs. Henderson from the diner had started bringing daily lunches for the team, fascinated by the transformation of the quiet mechanic she'd known for years into someone preparing to challenge a multinational corporation. The local newspaper had requested an interview, and even the mayor had stopped by to offer the town's unofficial support. "You know what I realized?" Leila said on the evening before they were scheduled to transport the Ferrari to Mterrey. 3 weeks ago, I thought I was just trying to get my car fixed. Now I'm part of something that could change the entire automotive industry. "Are you having second thoughts?" Samir asked, recognizing the tone of someone wrestling with the magnitude of what they'd undertaken. "The opposite. I'm having first thoughts, probably the first genuinely important thoughts I've had in my entire adult life." She gestured around the garage, taking in the evidence of their intensive work. "Everything I accomplished before this was just variations on spending money or looking attractive or saying the right things at social events. This is the first time I've ever been part of creating something that matters." The Ferrari sat under bright work lights, its restored body gleaming with the deep luster that only comes from hundreds of hours of careful attention. But more important than its appearance was what lay beneath the surface: engine management technology that represented years of innovative thinking, stolen dreams, and now the possibility of redemption. "Whatever happens tomorrow," Samir said, looking at his son and the woman who had become an unexpected partner in his quest for justice, "this has been the most meaningful work I've done since Miguel was born. Win or lose, we've built something together that's worth being proud of." Miguel nodded seriously, understanding in his direct way that they were on the threshold of something that would change all their lives. "Papa, the diagnostic readings show the engine is operating at 99.7% of theoretical efficiency. That's better than the original prototype specifications." "How is that possible?" "Because we're not just restoring your old work," Leila answered, her voice carrying quiet confidence. "We're proving that it was even better than anyone realized, including you." Outside, the coastal fog was rolling in with unusual thickness, wrapping the small town in mystery and muffling the sounds of evening traffic. Tomorrow they would load the Ferrari onto a transport trailer and drive to Mterrey, where they would either vindicate 15 years of injustice or fail spectacularly in front of the people whose respect Samir had spent half his lifetime trying to earn back. But tonight, in the warm glow of work lights and the satisfaction of a job done with absolute precision, 3 people from different worlds sat together in comfortable silence, sharing the knowledge that they had done everything possible to prepare for the confrontation ahead. The Mterrey Classic Car Show occupied 17 acres of manicured grounds overlooking the Pacific Ocean, where the world's most valuable automobiles competed for attention against a backdrop of cypress trees and crashing waves. Samir had attended this event once before, 15 years earlier, when he'd still been Dr. Samir Ortega and his prototype engine management system was generating excitement throughout the automotive industry. Now he stood beside his restored Ferrari in the technical demonstration area, wearing the same navy blazer he'd kept from his engineering days, watching as industry executives and automotive journalists gathered around their display. The morning fog was just beginning to lift, revealing the scope of the crowd that had assembled to witness what automotive magazines were calling the most controversial technical presentation in show history. Miguel stood beside him, dressed in his best clothes and clutching a clipboard containing the diagnostic data they'd meticulously compiled. His role in the presentation was crucially would operate the engine monitoring equipment, while Samir demonstrated the system's capabilities, providing real-time confirmation of the performance claims. "Remember," Samir whispered to his son, "when I ask for the fuel mixture readings, call out the numbers exactly as they appear on the screen. Don't round up or down, even if the figures seem complicated." "Papa, I've been reading diagnostic data for 3 years. I know how to be precise." Miguel's response carried the gentle reproach of someone whose competence was being questioned unfairly. Leila approached from the registration tent, her expression tense but determined. She traded her usual casual clothes for a business suit that somehow managed to look both professional and approachably an outfit chosen to convey serious intent without intimidating the working engineers who formed their most important audience. "David Chen just arrived," she announced quietly. "He's brought a team of lawyers and his head of engineering. They're setting up their own display, 3 pavilions over, advertising breakthrough innovations in luxury vehicle performance systems." Samir felt his stomach tighten. He'd known this confrontation was inevitable, but facing it in such a public forum added layers of complexity he hadn't fully anticipated. "What kind of display?" "From what I could see, it's mostly marketing materials and corporate promotional videos. Nothing hands-on, nothing that would let people examine the actual technology." She paused, studying his face. "Samir, there are over 200 people waiting to see your presentation. This isn't just about proving your case anymore, it's about demonstrating that truth matters more than corporate power." The words carried weight beyond their immediate meaning. This moment represented not just vindication for stolen work, but a test of whether expertise and honesty could prevail against wealth and influence in an industry that often prioritized commercial success over technical integrity. Marcus Webb emerged from the crowd, looking nervous but carrying a laptop case that contained years of archived development files. "I've been talking to some of the automotive journalists," he reported. "They're fascinated by the story, but they want to see concrete proof, not just allegations. The demonstration needs to be flawless." "It will be," Miguel declared with the confidence that came from absolute certainty about technical matters. "Papa's engine management system is operating at optimal parameters. The diagnostic readings confirm theoretical performance across all measurement criteria." As the scheduled presentation time approached, the crowd around their display grew larger and more diverse. Samir recognized faces from his engineering days' former colleagues who'd heard rumors about his downfall but never learned the full story. Industry executives who'd profited from licensing David Chen's innovations, technical specialists whose respect he'd once earned and hoped to regain. At exactly 10 o'clock, Leila stepped forward to address the assembled audience, her voice carrying clearly across the demonstration area. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us this morning. What you're about to witness is more than a technical demonstration. It's the revelation of one of the automotive industry's most significant cases of intellectual property theft, and the vindication of the brilliant engineer whose work was stolen and claimed by someone else." She gestured towards Samir, who stepped forward with the measured confidence of someone who'd spent weeks preparing for this moment. "Dr. Samir Ortega is the true creator of the engine management technology that has revolutionized luxury vehicle performance over the past 15 years. Today, he will demonstrate his mastery of these systems by showing you capabilities that the current patent holders have never revealed publicly." A murmur ran through the crowd as people processed the implications of what they were hearing. Several automotive journalists began recording on their phones, while industry executives exchanged glances that ranged from skeptical to concerned. "Before we begin the technical demonstration," Samir said, his voice steady despite the magnitude of the moment, I want to acknowledge that what you're about to see will challenge assumptions that have shaped business relationships worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I don't make these claims lightly, and I understand the seriousness of what I'm alleging." He paused, looking out at the crowd that contained both supporters and skeptics, friends and enemies, people whose careers could be affected by what happened in the next hour. But truth has its own authority, and technical expertise speaks for itself. What I'm going to show you today is evidence that can't be dismissed or discredited, the evidence of deep, intimate knowledge of systems that I designed, developed, and perfected over years of dedicated work. Miguel activated the diagnostic computers, and immediately the screens filled with data streams that revealed the Ferrari's engine operating in real time. The numbers were impressive even to people unfamiliar with the technical detail sufficiency ratings, emissions levels, and performance metrics that exceeded anything currently available in production vehicles. "Now," Samir announced, "let me show you what this technology can really do." The demonstration began with what appeared to be simple engine adjustments, but quickly revealed the sophisticated engineering that separated revolutionary technology from conventional approaches. Samir connected his laptop to the Ferrari's engine management system and began modifying parameters in real time, each change producing immediate and measurable results on the diagnostic displays. "Traditional fuel injection systems operate with fixed parameters," he explained to the crowd, his voice carrying the authority of someone who understood every aspect of what he was discussing. "But this system adapts continuously to environmental conditions, fuel quality, engine temperature, and even driving style. Watch what happens when I adjust the atmospheric pressure compensation." Miguel called out the diagnostic readings as they changed. Fuel efficiency increasing from 22.4 to 24.7 miles per gallon. Emissions dropping by 12%. Power output maintaining optimal levels despite reduced fuel consumption. The crowd pressed closer, industry experts recognizing immediately that they were witnessing capabilities that exceeded anything currently available in production vehicles. Several people began taking notes, while automotive journalists positioned themselves for better views of the diagnostic screens. "Now I'll demonstrate something that the current patent holders have never shown publicly," Samir announced, opening a different section of the engine management software. Active learning algorithms that allow the system to improve its own performance over time. He began typing commands that modified the system's base programming, each change building on the previous adjustment in ways that revealed intimate knowledge of the software architecture. The diagnostic readings showed the engine's performance improving in real time, as if the machine was learning to operate more efficiently through Samir's guidance. "Papa," Miguel called out excitedly, "the thermal efficiency just exceeded theoretical maximum." A murmur of amazement ran through the crowd. Dr. Jennifer Hartwell, chief engineer for a major German luxury manufacturer, stepped forward with questions that tested the limits of Samir's knowledge. "Dr. Ortega, can you explain how the system compensates for fuel octane variations without requiring manual input from the driver?" Samir's answer was immediate and precise, drawing on years of development work that only the system's original creator could possess. The NOx sensors provide real-time combustion analysis, but the innovation is in the predictive algorithms that adjust timing based on fuel behavior patterns rather than just reactive NOx detection. Dr. Hartwell nodded, clearly impressed. "And the cold start emissions optimization? Multi-phase fuel delivery during the first 60 seconds of operation, combined with predictive catalyst warm-up based on ambient temperature and previous driving patterns. The system actually learns your typical morning routine and pre-optimizes accordingly." The technical dialogue continued for several minutes, with industry experts asking increasingly sophisticated questions that Samir answered with the fluency of someone who had lived with this technology for years. Each response demonstrated not just theoretical knowledge, but the deep, practical understanding that came from hands-on development work. Then, David Chen arrived. He appeared at the edge of the crowd with his legal team and several corporate executives, his expression a carefully controlled mixture of confidence and concern. Samir recognized him immediately older now, grayer, but carrying himself with the same arrogant certainty that had made their original partnership impossible. "Interesting presentation," David called out, his voice cutting through the technical discussions. "Though I have to wonder about the legality of modifying patented technology without proper licensing arrangements." The crowd turned to watch this confrontation, sensing the personal drama underlying the technical dispute. Samir met David's eyes directly, 15 years of suppressed anger crystallizing into focused determination. "I'm not modifying your technology, David. I'm demonstrating my own work that you stole and claimed as your own invention." "That's a serious accusation, Samir. I hope you have evidence to support such claims." Marcus Webb stepped forward, opening his laptop case. "Actually, we do. 15 years of development files, email correspondence, and source code that prove the real history of this technology's creation." As Marcus began displaying archived documents on a portable projector, the crowd saw the devastating evidence, emails showing David's systematic appropriation of Samir's work, patent applications that had been modified to remove Samir's name, and source code comments that proved the software's true authorship. "Ladies and gentlemen," Leila announced, her voice carrying across the now silent demonstration area, "what you're seeing is documented proof of one of the automotive industry's most significant cases of intellectual property theft. The technology that has generated hundreds of millions in licensing revenue was stolen from its actual creator and claimed by someone who contributed nothing to its development." David's confident expression was beginning to crack, his legal team huddling around him in urgent consultation. But the damage was already done. The evidence was undeniable, presented in front of the most influential audience in the automotive world. Dr. Hartwell stepped forward again, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinion mattered throughout the industry. "Dr. Ortega, based on what I've seen today, I believe your claims are completely credible. Your knowledge of this technology is far too detailed and intimate to have been acquired through reverse engineering or analysis. You clearly created this system." Other voices from the crowd echoed her assessment, and Samir felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years, the recognition of his peers, freely given based on demonstrated expertise rather than corporate politics or legal maneuvering. Miguel, who had been watching the adult drama unfold while maintaining perfect focus on his diagnostic duties, suddenly spoke up with characteristic directness. "Chen, why did you steal Papa's work? Didn't you know that was wrong?" The innocent question, delivered without malice or guile, hit David harder than any legal threat or technical challenge. Faced with a 12-year-old boy's simple moral clarity, his carefully constructed justifications crumbled. The development was collaborative. The patents were filed according to standard procedures. His voice trailed off as he realized how hollow his explanations sounded. The crowd began to disperse, industry executives making phone calls that would reshape business relationships worth millions of dollars, journalists filing stories that would make headlines across the automotive world, and engineers talking excitedly about the implications of what they'd witnessed. But for Samir, the most important moment came when Dr. Hartwell approached with an offer that would change everything. "Dr. Ortega, my company would be very interested in discussing legitimate licensing arrangements for this technology with its actual creator." 6 months later, the small coastal town of Millbrook Bay had undergone a transformation that mirrored the changes in its most famous resident's life. Where Ortega's auto repair had once occupied a modest building with peeling paint and cracked asphalt, there now stood a modern engineering facility with gleaming equipment and a professionally painted sign reading Ortega Associates Automotive Engineering. Samir stood in his new office, reviewing licensing agreements with 3 major manufacturers who had approached him directly after the Mterrey demonstration. The legal battles with David Chen had been resolved more quickly than anyone expected, faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of criminal fraud charges. Chen had agreed to a settlement that included financial compensation, patent transfers, and public acknowledgement of Samir's role as the technology's original creator. But money and vindication, while satisfying, weren't the changes that mattered most to him. Through the office window, he could see Miguel working with two other children in the facility's education center, teaching them basic engine principles with the patient enthusiasm he'd inherited from his father. The center was Leila's idea, place where kids with learning differences could explore mechanical engineering in an environment designed for their unique ways of understanding the world. The team from Mercedes arrives at 2 o'clock, Leila announced, entering the office with a tablet full of schedule updates. She'd traded her designer clothes for practical business attire that somehow managed to look both professional and approachable, though she still moved with the unconscious elegance that no amount of garage work could completely eliminate. "Are you nervous?" she asked, noting the way he was staring out the window instead of reviewing the technical presentations they'd prepared. "Not about the meeting, about everything else." Samir turned to face her, his expression mixing contentment with a lingering disbelief that his life had changed so completely. "6 months ago, I was a small-town mechanic fixing pickup trucks and trying to save enough money for Miguel's college education. Now I'm running an engineering consultancy with contracts worth more than I made in my entire previous career." "And you're engaged to a woman who used to mock small-town mechanics," Leila added, her tone carrying the gentle humor that had developed between them over months of shared work and growing intimacy. The engagement had surprised everyone, including themselves. What had begun as a working relationship based on mutual respect had gradually deepened into something neither had expected to find at this stage of their lives. Their love was built on shared purpose rather than romantic fantasia partnership between equals who had discovered they worked better together than apart. "My mother still can't believe I'm marrying someone who repairs cars for a living," Leila continued, settling into the chair across from his desk. "She keeps asking when you're going to hire someone else to do the dirty work so you can focus on management." "What do you tell her?" "That getting my hands dirty is the best part of the job. That understanding how things actually work is more valuable than managing people who do the work for you." She paused, studying his face. "Do you think she'll ever understand?" "Give her time. Your whole family is still adjusting to the idea that you've found something you're genuinely passionate about, instead of just filling time between social obligations." The Mercedes meeting went better than either of them had hoped. The German engineers were impressed not just by the sophistication of Samir's technology, but by his ability to explain complex concepts in ways that revealed both deep understanding and practical experience. They left with preliminary agreements for licensing arrangements that would integrate his innovations into their next generation of luxury vehicles. As evening approached, the three of them, Samir, Leila, and Miguel, sat together in the garage area that still occupied part of the building. The Ferrari rested under soft lights, its restoration complete, but its role in their lives ongoing. They decided to keep the car rather than sell it, partly for sentimental reasons, but mainly because it served as a perfect demonstration vehicle for potential clients. "Papa," Miguel said, looking up from the homework he'd been completing at his favorite workbench, "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you can teach her grandson about engine repair. He's having trouble in school, and she thinks working with his hands might help." "What do you think?" Samir asked, though he already knew the answer. Miguel's gift for recognizing potential in other children had become legendary in their small town. "I think Jake would be good at diagnostic work. He notices details that other people miss, just like me." Miguel's assessment carried the authority of someone whose judgment about mechanical aptitude had proven remarkably accurate. "Then we'll make room for him in the education center." Leila watched this exchange with the satisfaction of someone who had helped create something meaningful from nothing. The education center was already serving 12 children, providing them with hands-on learning experiences that traditional schools couldn't offer. Several had shown remarkable aptitude for mechanical work, while others had simply gained confidence from mastering skills that played to their particular strengths. "I've been thinking about expansion," she said, pulling out her tablet to show them architectural drawings. "If we renovate the building next door, we could add 3 more workshop spaces and a proper classroom for theoretical instruction." Samir studied the plans, recognizing the same careful attention to detail that Leila brought to everything she committed to. "The budget? Covered by the licensing deals you signed last month, with enough left over to hire 2 additional instructors." She paused, meeting his eyes. "Unless you think we're growing too fast." "I think we're growing at exactly the right pace for people who spent too many years not growing at all." As they prepared to lock up for the evening, Samir took one last look around the facility that had become the center of their new life together. The sophisticated equipment, the organized workspace, the evidence of success and recognition of it was satisfying in ways he'd almost forgotten were possible. But what mattered most wasn't the vindication or the financial security or even the professional recognition. What mattered was the family he'd built with Leila, the community they were creating for children like Miguel, and the knowledge that his work was making a genuine difference in people's lives. Outside, the coastal fog was beginning to roll in from the ocean, wrapping their small town in the soft grey mystery that had welcomed him years ago when he'd arrived with nothing but wounded pride and love for his son. Now, as he walked toward the apartment that would soon become the house he would share with Leila, Samir felt something he hadn't experienced since before David Chen's betrayal, complete confidence in the future he was building. Behind him, the workshop sign glowed softly in the evening light. Ortega, Associates Engineering, where innovation meets integrity. It was more than a slogan, it was a promise that broken things, whether engines or hearts or dreams, could always be restored by people willing to do the careful work that healing required.